This past year has made people really reevaluate their priorities. In fact, employers are having a hard time finding people to take their jobs, and lots of people have ideas of why that is, but some of it has to do with the fact that people are not willing to do the work they once did because they've decided that they have different priorities. They're not willing to put up with the coworkers they once had or the management that they once had. We aren't willing to just do anything. Because when you have watched a huge amount of people die from a disease, and in many cases it's very arbitrary. It initially was supposed to just be those who were older or had underlying health issues, but you then watch younger people perish from that disease. It starts to make you change your priorities. Ecclesiastes was what we read from today. Joy did a great job, but it's not an easy thing to read because it's not too many places in the Bible that we hear that life is meaningless. And Solomon doesn't just say it once, he reminds us a second time that life is meaningless. Not too many people know this about Ecclesiastes. It is often quoted, the third chapter, right? There's a time for everything. What people don't ever do is continue reading after that, and it says there's a time for all these things, and so we should just let time happen because life is meaningless. It's not a particularly uplifting message. And yet, for those of us that have experienced the bad parts of life, it can speak to us. It's not that he's actually saying that life is meaningless. What he says is that we often have such illusions of control, and yet we really have no idea what will come our way. He says that we have assumptions that we make, that the rich will have food, but that's not always true. That the wise will have good life, but that's not always true. And so what he says is, enjoy this life while you can. And he lists it in a particular way of how we enjoy this life, which is to spend time, and the translation we read today says with your wife. Let's expand that and say with your spouse, and let's expand that and say with your family, right? Because clearly Solomon doesn't just mean that spending time with one person is what will make you enjoy life, but that it's about spending time with our priorities in the right place. We are working on a series through the 5 love languages. If you've never heard of this book, it's by Gary Chapman, and he says that we all communicate love and hear love in different ways. Last week we talked about words of affirmation, and I was going to ask you how you were doing, and yet I got to experience it live here because I loved how people encouraged Elizabeth today. That was one of the things we talked about last week, that words of affirmation can include encouraging one another, meaning be bold. Today we're talking about quality time. Chapman says that we all have a particular language that we understand better than any other, but that we need to learn how to speak all of the languages in order to communicate love more effectively. And so as I said, Ecclesiastes invites us to focus on our priorities. And of course, most of us, if we were to think right away, we would come to the reality that for us, quality time with those that we love, our spouse or our other family members, would be important. We would say, yes, that's a priority. And yet we don't always live that way. And sometimes it takes a particular life event for us to really realize how important those things are. There was a senator in the 80s, Paul Tsongas, and he was diagnosed with cancer. He actually was in the presidential running at one point even. He was a senator from Massachusetts and was pursuing a life in politics, but then was diagnosed with cancer, and he chose, rather than to run another time to step back from his political career because of his illness. He ended up being treated and then going on to have more of a political career, but in that moment when he first was diagnosed and he chose to step back and to take a break from his political career, he received a letter from a friend named Arnold Sack, and this is a phrase that I have heard repeated throughout my life in one form or another, but I was able to trace back. This is the origin. The earliest mention that we have it is in this letter from Arnold Sack. He said, "No one on his deathbed ever said, 'I wish I had spent more time on my business.'" I've heard it as, no one ever says they wish they had worked more in life when they come to the end of their life. And yet, we don't live life in that way, if I'm being honest. Even though I would say that quality time with my family is a priority, often work is the de facto priority. I spend more time working than I do doing anything else other than sleeping, it would seem. And I also say that I would rather spend quality time with my family, but I also spend a lot of time on my phone and other devices. All these things are antithetical to quality time. Chapman says that quality time is about giving our full attention to something. And so it's not, staring at screens while being with your significant other. It means that you can be doing something, but that it's not about what you're doing. He's very clear to say this. And so he says, for instance, you can have quality time with your child throwing a ball back and forth. But the quality time is not about the fact that you are throwing the ball back and forth, but that you are doing it while focused on your child. That's what makes it quality time. And we all know this intuitively. My wife will speak to me, and I will be checking text messages or emails, something that I deem important. And she will say, "You're not really listening." And I will know that it's true, that I need to put my phone down if I really want to give my full attention. And so I think that this love language of all of them may be one of the hardest for many of us to learn, even though I told you how hard it has been for me to learn words of affirmation last week because that's not my natural inclination. But we as a culture particularly struggle with quality time, with giving our full attention, because we have this notion of multitasking, that I somehow can be doing one thing and another. I might be able to do more than one thing at a time, but I don't do them well. A best example would be that sometimes I am distracted, and my wife can tell that, and she will be talking to me, and she'll say, "You're not listening," and I will say, "Yes, I am listening," and she will say, "Well, what was I saying?" And I'm able to repeat back to her the words that she was saying, because our brains are able to process things more than one thing at a time. But you will figure out where your focus truly was if you can not only repeat the information, but truly give context to it. And more often than not, when I repeat back what I was hearing, I realize that I was not actually in the conversation, but I would have been able to tell her what I was doing on my phone. And so it's clear where my full attention was. And I struggle with this one. You can ask the staff here at church. They frequently say to me when they are talking to me, "Don't wander away." Because I have this tendency to be thinking about other things while listening and not giving my full attention. And I will start to walk away to go do something else, assuming that the conversation is over because I have not really been listening, and there is more that needs to be said. So, last week I told you that words of affirmation were not my love language, and you're going to be able to figure out that quality time is not my love language either. And so just like last week, I am learning how to speak it. And so we start with this idea of focused attention. And I heard that in the midst of pandemic, our ability to focus has actually gotten worse because we were forced to spend more time on devices in order to stay connected, and yet devices enable us to do lots of things, right? If I used to sit in a meeting, I had to be in the meeting, but on a meeting on Zoom, I can also be surfing the internet while listening to my meeting, and suddenly my full attention is not there. And so we've degraded our ability to pay attention, to focus. And so there are people out there telling us that we need to re-nurture this ability. And it simply is the same way that you would exercise or work a muscle. You start in small increments and build from there. And so they tell you to focus on only one thing for just a couple of minutes, and then go to 5 minutes, and then go to 10 minutes. That you actually have to exercise this ability to focus. And don't let yourself get distracted. And it is very hard. It's so easy to bounce from one thing to another, especially with the dings and reminders that we have in our lives. My computer makes a noise when I get a new email, and I'm maybe focused on something, but immediately I'm distracted. My phone makes a ding when I get a message or anything else happens, and I may be focused on something, but I immediately get distracted. And so we have to work on focusing our attention. Chapman says that quality time is also about quality conversation. And he says that quality conversation, more often than not, especially for someone whose love language is quality time, means that we need to be able to listen to them. That's what they're going to actually want. Quality time is going to mean that we are actually listening. And so again, I struggle with this as a culture, and we would need to work on listening. But he goes on to say it's not just listening. You also need to be able to talk. And I think I've told you previously, that my wife Megan will often ask me, "How was your day?" And I will say, "Good." And she says, "That's not good enough for me. I want to hear more." She's communicating that true conversation is not just me listening. I am more than willing to sit and listen to her for hours on end. But people want a response as well, in order for it to feel like a true conversation. Chapman says there are two kinds of people in his mind. There are people he calls the Dead Seas, and he says if you don't know what the Dead Sea is, it's in the Middle East. There's a river that flows into it, but it's called the Dead Sea because after that the water goes nowhere. And so it just terminates there. And he says people in conversation can be like the Dead Sea too. They take and they take and they take, they receive, and yet nothing ever goes anywhere after that. He says the opposite of that is the people that we would call babbling brooks, who are constantly making conversation, and it's always fresh and new and moving along. And he says that at first, a Dead Sea dating a babbling brook will be very happy, because the Dead Sea will just sit there and listen as the babbling brook talks, and the babbling brook will be very happy because they will just be talking as the Dead Sea listens. But after years of that, suddenly they will get sick of that. And so he says Dead Seas need to learn how to communicate, and babbling brooks need to learn how to listen if we're going to have true quality conversation. And that's part of what quality time is, having good conversation. Again, that can happen while you're doing something else, as long as your focused attention is on the person and not on the task. My wife and I frequently find this in the midst of cooking. We're able to sort of mindlessly chop things up and prepare food together while having a conversation. And so it's not that we are cooking together, it's that we're together cooking. And the focus is really on being with one another and spending quality time together. Another one is walking. We always find that we talk more together when we go for a walk. And so that's a great quality time kind of activity. Again, we're not focused on walking. That'll come later in life when I have more trouble walking. But right now I can still do it effortlessly. And so I'm able to focus on my relationship instead. Ecclesiastes says to spend time with your spouse. But as I said, undoubtedly this can be expanded to our family and even beyond our family. When we're at church, are we focused when we're here? Are we prepared to be with the people that will be coming in? Are we focused on the relationships? I, again, would confess that often I am at church focused on other things on Sunday morning, things that are going on. This morning we didn't have sound going out to our folks online at first, and I was working to figure that out. But it means I miss out on relationships, and I know that some of you are quality time people because I've heard you say, you're always running around on Sunday mornings. You don't have time for us. Yeah. I need to learn to speak that love language. And those of you for whom quality time is your love language, you don't need to learn this one, but the rest of us do. And we especially need to learn it because as we come here to church, we come to be in relationship with one who is always focused. God has lots of things going on, controls the cosmos, knows the weather, and yet is able to focus on each and every one of us. And as God's people, we're called to be different than the world, who is always distracted. There's always going to be something to pull our attention. We talk about existing in a 24-hour news cycle, and I don't think that that's even true. It's probably a couple of hours news cycle these days, where we hear something and then a few minutes later we hear another piece of news and we've probably moved on and forgotten the first piece that we heard. We are always having our attention pulled in multiple different directions. But there is a world out there that needs us to be more focused and less distracted. Because it's a world that needs love, and sometimes love is communicated through quality time. And so there's a world out there that needs us to be better at listening, but also to know when to stop listening and to speak so that there's an actual conversation going on, and to share what needs to be shared. It's a world that needs to know that they're more important than the other things that we have to do on our to-do list. It's more important than our work, more important than our entertainment, more important than our screens, more important than our devices. And just like those dead seas and babbling brooks, I find that the world is full of people that either think that the world is full of people who think that they're too perfect to need any help. And then there are those who see the world as a broken place full of people who only see themselves as worthless. I will admit that I tend to view the world as the latter. I see a lot of hurting people who do not see their own worth. I know that it can be tempting to believe that the world is full of people who are self-important and think that they need no help at all. It's probably because those are the types of people that seem to make it into our media and into positions of power, but the rest of the world seems to be one that is feeling hurt and lost and left out and lonely. And so people need to be shown that they are worth something, and again, for some of those people, it's going to mean that we need to communicate love to them through spending quality time with them. And Jesus was one who always made time. Jesus always had business to do. You'll notice that in the Gospels, he's always on the move. He's always headed to somewhere else. And he's always about his Father's business. He even says that. But it never stops him from stopping to make quality time for those that need it. He's in the midst of a crowd, and a woman reaches out and touches just the fringe of his cloak, and he could have kept walking. She was healed in that moment. That's what we're to understand in that story. But Jesus understands that there's a moment there to share some quality time, and so he stops and says, "Who is it that touched me?" He is out preaching and he's ready to go. He tells the disciples to get into a boat and to cross to the other side. But he soon finds that there are people in need of food, and he stops and makes quality time with them by making a miraculous meal. And so we are called to be those same people who always make time for others. So how do we do that? Well, I have a friend who does speak this love language, and I was talking to her this week and said, "Tell me, what should I say?" She said, "Well, definitely you tell people that they need to show up and be on time. Because people who want quality time, if they've said if they've said be here at 7, that means they want their full time with you. And you should be there at 7. Now, I do think that this is a little cultural, because I will tell you that there are other cultures where being late is totally acceptable, and sometimes you're late because you are spending quality time with someone else. This is totally unnerving to we Westerners, but often if you go to Africa and you're headed to a meeting and you see a friend on the street, you stop and spend a lot of time talking with that friend on the street, so much so that you may be late to your meeting. And those of us with watches, we really panic. You're late now to the meeting. Yes, but they have put an emphasis on quality time with that person. So sometimes I think this is cultural, but I do think her point is correct, that if you've made plans to spend quality time with someone, you better be on time and you better show up. And it's especially important to say that because we live in a culture now that has a tendency to only participate in something if there's nothing better going on. We give vague answers. I might be there. If I have time, I'll show up. Because we're waiting to see if there might be something more attractive or lucrative that we want to go to. So we need to show up. And obviously then, the things that Gary Chapman talks about, we need to learn how to listen. It's especially hard for those babbling brooks, less hard for me. The thing that I need to learn is how to speak. And some of you will be like me. You need to learn how to speak. He says, if you are one of those people, you need to, especially what people are wanting to hear in good conversation, is our emotions as well. And so what he says is often Dead Seas are people that when they were younger were taught that they shouldn't feel the emotions that they had, and so they've learned to sort of shut them down, and that we need to reconnect with those in order to actually have quality conversation with someone. I would also say that as we go out into the world and we meet people for whom quality time is their love language, that an important thing to remember is that as Christians, quality conversation is not about sharing some sort of platitude, right, that we think will make the person feel better. But instead, connecting with them on an emotional level. I have learned that sometimes some of the most powerful things I can say as a pastor are not, God's got this and everything's going to be okay, but simply to say, wow, that is terrible. I'm so sorry. Because they know that I've been affected by that emotionally. So we need to be able to connect to our emotions, and if you're a person, you'll know if you can't connect to your emotions. At least I think you will. I'm pretty evident, and I sometimes get described as sort of stone-faced. It's how I sometimes meet the world because I've been trained to do that, but in order to have good conversation, I'm having to learn how to open up more. And then obviously we need to be able to focus. Are we constantly thinking about the next thing that we have to do? Or are we really here in the moment, listening to what's going on, spending time with the people that we love? We need to make people our priority. Relationships should be more important than any to-do list. Because it's not about the things that we do in life. No one will ever say to themselves, I wish I had accomplished more work in life. But we do tend to feel like I wish I had spent more time with those people that I loved. And we may think that obituaries are made up out of the accomplishments that we have, but the reality is that as I go into situation after situation where I have to share about someone's life, it is almost never about what they did, but about how they connected with other people. So clearly that's what's more important than anything else. We are called to be a people who can speak love in a multitude of ways, and if this is not your normal language, then you're going to have to learn how to focus and how to have quality conversation, and then make sure to show up, because the world needs us, and Christ is counting on us to show love to others. Amen.